Hey there, time travelers. Grab a comfy seat, maybe a cup of tea or a cold one, and let's embark on a journey back to a time when the world was younger, wilder, and full of wonder. Picture this, a land where the red dust dances with the wind, where eucalyptus trees whisper secrets, and the stars above sing songs older than memory itself. This is Australia, but not the one with skyscrapers or surfers catching waves. This is Australia before anyone called it Australia. A vast, living canvas where the first people wove stories, songs, and dreams into the very fabric of the earth. In this episode, we're diving into the pre-colonial era, stretching back at least 60,000 years to when the first humans set foot on this continent, all the way up to 1606, when European sails first peeked over the horizon. We'll meet the Indigenous Australians, the Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders, whose culture is one of the oldest continuous ones on the planet. We'll explore their dreamtime stories, which are like the heartbeat of the land, their ingenious technologies that make modern engineers jealous, and a social network that connected hundreds of tribes without a single Wi-Fi router. We'll also marvel at a cast of creatures so unique they seem straight out of a fantasy novel. So, buckle up, or rather, settle by the campfire, and let's step into a world where the land itself tells the story. What's this episode about? This episode is all about the pre-colonial period of Australia, a time when the continent was a universe unto itself. We'll uncover how the first people arrived, probably on rickety rafts, and turned a challenging land into a thriving home. We'll dive into the dreamtime, a spiritual and cultural framework that explained everything from the shape of the mountains to the dance of the stars. We'll geek out over tools like boomerangs, which are basically ancient drones, and a fire-based farming technique that was eco-friendly before eco was a thing. We'll also explore a society of over 250 languages, connected by trade and ceremony, and a menagerie of animals that could only exist in Australia. It's a tale of resilience, creativity, and a deep bond with the land. Ready? Let's go. The first footprints. How humans found a new world. Imagine a world without maps, smartphones, or even a decent pair of shoes. It's around 60,000 years ago, and a group of adventurers from what we now call Southeast Asia are setting out on a journey that makes climbing Everest look like a Sunday stroll. They're on flimsy rafts or canoes, bobbing across choppy waters, guided only by the stars, the currents, and maybe a gut feeling that something incredible lies ahead. These are the ancestors of Australia's Indigenous peoples, Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders, and they're about to discover a continent that's been sitting alone in the ocean for millions of years. Back then, the Ice Age had locked up so much water in glaciers that sea levels were lower, creating land bridges and island chains between Asia and Australia. Think of it like nature's stepping stones, stretching from modern-day Indonesia or New Guinea to the northern shores of Australia. These folks, driven by curiosity, hunger, or maybe just a knack for adventure, made the leap. When they landed, maybe on the beaches of what's now Queensland or Arnhem Land, they found a land that was both a paradise and a puzzle. Vast deserts where the sun could fry you like a damper on a hot rock. Lush rainforests where the rain fell like someone tipped over a cosmic bucket. Rugged mountains, winding rivers, and swamps that seemed to hum with life. Australia was a challenge, but these people, they were ready for it. Archaeologists have found evidence of their presence dating back at least 50,000 years, like the stone tools and ceremonial burials at Lake Mungo in New South Wales. These weren't just random artifacts, they're proof of a people who didn't just survive but thrived. They spread across the continent, from the tropical north to the chilly shores of Tasmania, adapting to every climate and terrain. Each group developed its own way of life, its own stories, its own language. By the time they were done, they'd created a tapestry of cultures that covered every inch of this massive land. And here's the kicker, they did it all without a single written word. Talk about leaving a legacy. The dreamtime, stories that breathe life into the land. Now, picture yourself sitting under a sky so clear it feels like you could touch the stars. The fire crackles, sending sparks dancing like tiny fireflies. An elder, with hands weathered by time and eyes that hold a universe of wisdom, begins to speak. His voice is soft but strong, like the rustle of leaves in a breeze. He's telling a story about the rainbow serpent, a mighty spirit who carved rivers through the earth. Or maybe it's about the emu in the sky, a constellation that guided hunters through the night. This is the dreamtime, or, as some call it, the dreaming, the spiritual heartbeat of Indigenous Australian culture. The dreamtime isn't just a collection of bedtime stories. It's a way of understanding the world, a cosmic library of knowledge passed down through songs, dances, and ceremonies. It explains how the mountains rose, why the kangaroo hops, and how the stars found their place in the sky. Every rock, every tree, every waterhole has a story, and those stories connect people to the land in a way that's hard for us modern folks to grasp. For example, Uluru, that massive red rock in the heart of Australia, isn't just a geological wonder. To the Anangu people, it's a sacred site, home to spirits and stories that stretch back to the beginning of time. Stand at its base, listen to the wind whistling through its crevices, and you can almost feel the pulse of those ancient tales. But the dreamtime wasn't just about the past. It was a living guide for life. Songs called songlines were like GPS systems encoded in music. Sing the right song, and it could lead you across hundreds of miles of desert to a waterhole or a sacred site. These songs mapped the land, linking landmarks with stories. Imagine hiking through the outback, humming a tune that tells you exactly where to find water. That's not just navigation. That's poetry in motion. And then there's the art. If you've ever seen the rock paintings in Arnhem Land or Kakadu, you know they're not just doodles. These are epic sagas painted in ochre, red as a sunset, white as bone, yellow as the desert sun. A kangaroo drawn on a cave wall might tell the story of a great hunt. A spiral could mark a waterhole or a spirit's resting place. Some of these artworks are 40,000 years old, making them older than the pyramids or Stonehenge. Picture an artist, perched on a scorching rock, grinding ochre with a stone, painting a story that their great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren would still understand. That's not just art, that's immortality. The dreamtime also showed up in ceremonies called corroborees. Imagine a night lit by firelight, with drums made from animal hides thumping a rhythm that feels like the earth's heartbeat. People dance, their bodies painted with ochre, telling stories of creation or honoring ancestors. These weren't just parties, they were ways to strengthen community bonds, pass down knowledge, and keep the dreamtime alive. Some corroborees lasted days, with every song and step carrying meaning. It's like a Netflix binge, but instead of streaming, you're living the story. Technologies, boomerangs, fire, and a dash of genius. Let's talk tech. I know what you're thinking. Technology 60,000 years ago? What, sharpened sticks? Oh, friend, you're in for a surprise. The Indigenous Australians were like the Tony Starks of their time, crafting tools that were both practical and mind-blowingly clever. Take the boomerang. It's not just a curved stick you toss for fun, though, let's be honest, watching it spin back to you is pretty awesome. The boomerang was a masterpiece of aerodynamics. Some were designed to return, perfect for startling birds out of trees or showing off at a corroboree. Others were heavier, meant to fly straight and take down game like a kangaroo or an emu. Modern engineers have studied boomerangs and found their design rivals that of airplane wings. That's right, these folks were building flight tech before the Wright brothers were even a twinkle in history's eye. Then there's firestick farming, a technique so brilliant it makes you wonder why we don't all do it. Indigenous Australians deliberately set small, controlled fires to clear out dead grass and encourage new growth. These fires didn't just make the land easier to walk through. They attracted animals like kangaroos, who came to munch on the fresh green shoots. It was like setting up a buffet for hunters. Plus, it reduced the risk of massive wildfires by keeping fuel loads low. Imagine strolling through the outback, seeing lush patches of green where you lit a fire last season, and knowing you've just made your next hunt a whole lot easier. That's not just farming, that's terraforming. And don't sleep on their other tools. Spears tipped with stone or bone could pierce a kangaroo's hide from meters away. Stone axes, like those found at Lake Mungo, were so well crafted they could fell a tree or shape a canoe. They even wove nets from plant fibers for fishing and made hooks from shells. Picture a fisherman sitting by a river, his net woven from grass tougher than your gym socks, waiting for a barramundi to swim into his trap. That's not just survival, that's craftsmanship. They also had a knack for using the land's resources. Ochre wasn't just for painting, it was used in ceremonies, as sunscreen, or even as a trade item. They made glue from tree resin to attach spearheads, and crafted bags from kangaroo hide. Every part of an animal or plant had a purpose, like a Swiss Army knife made by nature. This wasn't just resourcefulness. It was a philosophy of waste not, want not that we could all learn from. A social network without Wi-Fi. Now, let's talk about society. Imagine a continent with no cities, no roads, no internet, but somehow, everyone's connected. Indigenous Australians lived in hundreds of tribes, speaking over 250 distinct languages. That's not just dialects, we're talking full-on languages, each with its own grammar, vocabulary, and rhythm. Some were as different as English is from Mandarin. And yet, these tribes weren't isolated. They built a social network that spanned thousands of miles, no Wi-Fi required. Trade was the glue that held it together. Tribes in the desert traded ochre for shells from coastal groups. Stone tools from one region might end up hundreds of miles away, swapped for fish or feathers. It was like an ancient Amazon, but instead of clicking "add to cart," you walked across a desert with a bundle of goods on your back. These trade routes weren't just about stuff, they were about relationships. Marriages between tribes, shared ceremonies, and storytelling sessions kept everyone connected. Each tribe had its own territory, marked not by fences but by stories and songlines. Elders were the keepers of knowledge, passing down laws and traditions. There were no kings or presidents, but there were leaders chosen for their wisdom or skill. And then there were the corroborees, massive gatherings where tribes came together to dance, sing, and share. Picture a festival where the music tells the story of your ancestors, and every step is a tribute to the land. These events could last days, with painted bodies moving in sync under the stars. It was like Woodstock, but with deeper meaning and better face paint. This society wasn't perfect, there were disputes of course. But it was built on respect for the land and each other. The land wasn't something you owned, it was something you cared for, like a family member. Every decision, from where to hunt to when to move camp, was made with the land in mind. Imagine living in a world where your backyard is sacred, and every step is a prayer. That's the kind of connection we're talking about. Unique fauna, a zoo from another planet. Australia's animals are like something a sci-fi writer dreamed up after too much eucalyptus tea. Kangaroos that bound across the plains faster than your cousin running for the last slice of pizza. Koalas that spend 20 hours a day napping in trees, munching leaves that smell like a menthol cough drop. Echidnas, spiky little oddballs that lay eggs despite being mammals. And let's not forget the platypus, a creature so weird, with its duck bill and webbed feet, that the first Europeans who saw it thought it was a prank. This menagerie evolved in isolation because Australia broke away from other continents millions of years ago. While lions roamed Africa and wolves prowled Europe, Australia was a playground for marsupials and monotremes. And back in the pre-colonial days, there were even wilder creatures, Megafauna like diprotodons, giant wombat-like beasts the size of rhinos, or 2-meter-tall kangaroos that could probably dunk on LeBron James. These giants vanished, likely due to climate changes or early human hunting, but their bones still lie in the outback, whispering of a wilder time. For Indigenous Australians, these animals weren't just food or resources, they were part of the dreamtime. A kangaroo might be a totem, a spiritual ancestor you honored rather than hunted. Emus, with their long strides, appeared in stories as messengers of the land. Even the humble goanna, a lizard that looks like it's auditioning for a dinosaur movie, had its place in the myths. Hunters used every part of an animal: meat for food, hides for clothing, bones for tools. Imagine skinning a kangaroo with a stone knife, knowing its spirit is watching, and thanking it for its gift. That's not just hunting, that's respect. Historical context: an island singing its own song. Why did Australia stay so isolated for so long? Blame geography. Surrounded by vast oceans, it was like a spaceship adrift in a sea of stars. No empires from Asia or Africa dropped by. No trade routes from ancient Rome or China touched its shores. This isolation gave Indigenous Australians the space to create a culture unlike any other. They didn't build pyramids or castles, but they didn't need to. Their monuments were the land itself, the songlines, the rock art, the stories that lived in every hill and river. Archaeological finds, like the 50,000-year-old tools at Lake Mungo or the ochre-covered burials, show a society with deep spiritual and practical knowledge. They tracked climate changes through oral histories, navigated deserts with songs, and managed ecosystems with fire. Modern ecologists still study their methods, marveling at how they kept the land thriving. This wasn't a primitive society, it was a masterclass in living with the earth, not against it. The Dutch stumble upon a new land. Imagine it's 1606, and you're Willem Janszoon, a Dutch sea captain with a beard probably crustier than the barnacles on your ship, the Duifken. This little vessel, barely bigger than a modern yacht, is bobbing through uncharted waters near New Guinea, chasing dreams of gold, spices, and glory for the Dutch East India Company. The early 17th century is like the Wild West of exploration. European powers are racing to claim new lands, like kids scrambling for the last slice of pavlova at a barbecue. You're scanning the horizon, hoping for a tropical paradise stacked with trade goods, when you spot land. It's rugged, it's wild, and it's definitely not on your map. You've just become the first European to set foot on Australia, landing on the Cape York Peninsula in what's now Queensland. Cue the confetti, right? Not so fast. Janszoon wasn't exactly popping champagne. The shore was swampy, the mangroves looked like they were plotting something, and the locals, likely the Wick people, weren't rolling out a red carpet. In fact, things got heated, and a skirmish left one of Janszoon's crew dead. He took one look at the marshy coastline, saw no gold or spice bazaars, and thought, nope, this place is a bust. He scribbled some notes, named the land New Holland, because apparently every new place got a Dutch-themed name back then, and sailed off, probably muttering about better prospects in Java. The Dutch East India Company wasn't in the mood for nation-building. They wanted quick cash, and Australia's deserts and scattered resources didn't scream, get rich quick. But the Dutch weren't done with Australia. They were like that friend who keeps texting even after you've ghosted them. In 1616, Dirk Hartog sailed in, landing on a windswept island off Western Australia, now creatively named Dirk Hartog Island. He didn't find much to write home about, just sand, scrub, and a whole lot of nothing. But he decided to leave his mark. Literally. He nailed a pewter plate to a post, scratching his name, the date, and a brief, "Wish you were here," for future explorers. That plate, my friends, is one of the oldest European artifacts in Australia, like a 17th-century post-it note saying, Dirk was here, 1616. Kinda boring, 2/10. Other Dutch explorers kept poking around, like Abel Tasman in 1642, who mapped parts of the southern coast and named it Van Diemen's Land, after his boss, because sucking up never goes out of style. He also charted bits of the northern and western coasts, but every time, the verdict was the same: nice beaches, no spices, let's bounce. The Dutch saw Australia as a big, dry roadblock on their way to the spice-rich East Indies. They'd sail up, squint at the horizon, see endless sand instead of cinnamon, and head back to their trading posts in Indonesia. To them, New Holland was like a pop-up ad you close without clicking. Intriguing, but not worth the effort. Why didn't the Dutch stay? It's simple. They were merchants, not settlers. The East India Company was all about profit margins, not planting flags for the long haul. Australia's lack of obvious riches, no glittering cities, no spice plantations, no bustling markets, made it a hard pass. Plus, the logistics were a nightmare. The journey from Europe took months, the coast was treacherous with reefs, and the locals weren't exactly handing out welcome baskets. The Dutch left their maps and their pewter plates, but their hearts stayed in the spice trade. James Cook, the mapmaker who changed everything. Fast forward to 1770. The scene's different now. Enter James Cook, a Yorkshire-born navigator with a knack for precision and a ship called the Endeavour that's about to make history. Cook wasn't just some salty sailor looking for a quick buck. He was a scientist at heart, obsessed with charting the unknown. Picture him standing on the deck, squinting through a telescope, his coat flapping in the wind like a proper 18th-century action hero. Britain's in the middle of its empire-building phase, fresh off losing the American colonies in 1776 and hungry for new territories to call their own. The Pacific. It's the new frontier, and Cook's mission is to explore, map, and maybe claim a few bits of land for King George III. Cook lands at a place he calls Botany Bay, named for the wild array of plants that had his botanist, Joseph Banks, practically swooning. It's April 1770, and the east coast of Australia, what's now New South Wales, looks promising. The beaches are golden, the waves crash like they're auditioning for a postcard, but there's a catch. Fresh water is harder to find than a parking spot in Sydney on a Saturday night. Cook and his crew meet the local Gweagal people, who are understandably wary of these pale strangers with funny hats. There's a tense moment, a few musket shots fired over heads, some spears thrown in response, but no major conflict. Cook's not here to fight, he's here to map. He sails north, charting the coast with the precision of a guy who probably color-coded his socks. His maps are so detailed they're practically works of art, capturing every curve of the shoreline from Botany Bay to the Great Barrier Reef. But that reef? It's a ship killer. The Endeavour runs aground, forcing Cook and his crew to camp out for weeks, patching their ship while Banks collects plants like a kid in a candy store. Cook names the area Cape Tribulation, because, well, tribulation sums up getting stuck on a coral reef pretty well. After exploring the east coast, Cook plants a flag at Possession Island and claims the whole region for Britain, calling it New South Wales. Why? Because he could, and because Britain was in a flag-planting mood. He sails back to England, his maps tucked under his arm like a treasure chest. Those charts weren't just lines on paper. They were the blueprint for Britain's future in Australia. Cook recommended a spot called Port Jackson, modern-day Sydney, for settlement, noting its deep harbor and better water supply compared to Botany Bay's swampy disappointment. Spoiler alert, he was right, and Port Jackson would soon become the beating heart of a new colony. Cook's voyage wasn't just about maps. He and Banks brought back stories of a land teeming with strange creatures, kangaroos that hopped like living pogo sticks, birds that laughed like they'd heard the world's best joke, hello, Kookaburra. Banks was so smitten he practically begged Parliament to colonize the place. Cook's meticulous work made Australia not just a dot on the map, but a destination Britain couldn't ignore. His legacy? A name etched in history and a harbor that would one day host a certain iconic opera house. Terra Nullius. The lie that changed a continent. Now, let's talk about something less heroic. Terra Nullius. It's Latin for nobody's land, and it's the idea that Britain used to justify claiming Australia. Picture a British lawyer in a powdered wig, sipping tea and declaring, "Well, this land looks empty to me." Never mind the tens of thousands of Indigenous Australians who'd been living here for 60,000 years, with their dreamtime stories, songlines, and thriving communities. To the British, if you weren't farming fields or building castles, you didn't count as owning the land. It's like walking into someone's house, seeing they don't have a picket fence, and saying, "Guess this place is mine now." Terra Nullius wasn't just a legal term, it was a mindset. It ignored the sophisticated social structures, trade networks, and spiritual connections to the land we explored in Episode 1. The indigenous peoples didn't fence off their territories or write deeds on parchment, but they had a profound relationship with the land, marked by songlines and sacred sites like Uluru. To them, the land wasn't property, it was family. But to the British, it was a blank slate, ripe for the taking. This concept would fuel land disputes and cultural devastation for centuries, as settlers moved in, assuming the locals were just passing through. Why did Terra Nullius take hold? It was convenient. The British Empire was in expansion mode, licking its wounds after losing America in 1776. Australia looked like a fresh start, a place to send convicts, grow crops, and wave the Union Jack. Declaring the land empty was an easy way to sidestep tricky questions about Indigenous rights. It's like pretending the fridge is empty so you don't have to share the last slice of cake. This idea wasn't seriously challenged until the 20th century, when Indigenous activists like Eddie Mabwa fought to prove their deep ties to the land. But in 1770, Terra Nullius was the green light Britain needed to start dreaming of colonies. Quirky moments, plates, bays, and near misses. Let's sprinkle in some fun facts to keep things lively. That pewter plate Dirk Hartog left in 1616? It wasn't just a random act of vandalism. It was a tradition among European explorers to leave markers, like cosmic graffiti saying, "We were here first." Hartog's plate was found decades later, still clinging to its post, and is now in a museum, a relic of a time when explorers thought nailing a dish to a tree was peak legacy building. Another Dutch captain, Willem de Vlaming, found it in 1697, swapped it for a new one, and took the original home as a souvenir. Talk about a collector's item. Then there's Cook's misadventure at Botany Bay. He arrived expecting a tropical paradise, maybe picturing palm trees and coconuts. Instead, he got a swampy shore, scarce water, and locals who weren't thrilled about uninvited guests. He poked around, named the place for its plants, but quickly realized it wasn't settler-friendly. His pivot to Port Jackson was a stroke of genius. That harbor's deep waters and sheltered coves made it the perfect spot for what would become Sydney. Imagine Cook, squinting at the swamp, shaking his head, and saying, "Yeah, let's try the next bay." Good call, Jim. Another quirky tidbit: the Dutch and British weren't the only ones sniffing around. The Portuguese and Spanish might have brushed past Australia's northern coasts in the 16th century, but their records are fuzzier than a koala's fur. Some historians think Portuguese sailors might have beaten Jansoon to the punch, but without a pewter plate or a decent map, they didn't get the credit. It's like showing up to a party but forgetting to sign the guest book. No one remembers you were there. Historical context: the age of exploration. Why were Europeans poking around Australia in the first place? It was the age of exploration, a time when Europe was buzzing with ambition. Think of it as a global treasure hunt, with empires like Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands racing to claim new lands, trade routes, and bragging rights. The Dutch were deep into their golden age, raking in profits from spices in the East Indies. The British, meanwhile, were building an empire where the sun never set, mostly because they kept claiming new time zones. Losing the American colonies in 1776 stung, and Britain was itching for new territories to flex its imperial muscles. Australia wasn't an obvious prize at first. The Dutch saw it as a dry, unprofitable detour. But by Cook's time, Britain's mindset had shifted. The Pacific was the new frontier, and Australia's east coast, with its fertile land and strategic harbors, looked like a blank canvas for colonies, farms, and maybe a prison or two. The scientific spirit of the Enlightenment also played a role. Cook's voyage wasn't just about claiming land, it was about discovery, with botanists like Banks cataloging plants and animals like they were curating a museum. This mix of imperial hunger, scientific curiosity, and navigational prowess set the stage for what was coming. A fleet of ships, a cargo of convicts, and a new era for Australia. It's 1788, and a ragtag fleet of 11 ships limps into a sparkling harbor under a blazing Australian sun. These aren't your typical explorers carrying dreams of glory. They're packed with convicts, sailors, and a few optimistic officers, all under the command of a guy named Arthur Phillip, who's probably wondering what he signed up for. This is the First Fleet, and it's about to kick off Britain's grand experiment in turning a distant land into a penal colony. In this episode, we're diving into the convict era, from 1788 to 1850, when Australia went from an indigenous heartland to a sprawling network of British settlements. We'll explore the gritty reality of the convict system, where petty thieves were shipped halfway across the world for stealing a loaf of bread. We'll watch colonies sprout in Sydney, Tasmania, Queensland, and beyond, like stubborn weeds in a desert. We'll meet characters like Mary Ray Bay, a convict-turned-business mogul who'd give modern entrepreneurs a run for their money. And we'll face the darker side, the clashes with indigenous peoples as their lands were taken. It's a story of survival, ambition, and the messy birth of a nation. So, let's step onto the creaky decks of the First Fleet and see how this wild chapter unfolds. The First Fleet, a risky voyage to a new world. It's January 1788, and the waters of Port Jackson, what we now call Sydney Harbour, are shimmering like a sheet of glass under the summer sun. 11 ships, looking like they've seen better days, drop anchor after a grueling 8-month journey from England. This is the First Fleet, a motley flotilla carrying about 1,400 souls, 750 or so convicts, chained and seasick, a few hundred sailors, probably dreaming of rum, and a handful of officers led by Captain Arthur Phillip, a no-nonsense naval man tasked with turning this far-flung shore into a colony. Imagine Phillip standing on the deck of the Sirius, squinting at the eucalyptus-lined shore, thinking, well, this is either the start of something big or the worst career move I've ever made. The journey was no picnic. Picture crossing the globe in wooden ships, packed tighter than a modern subway at rush hour, with storms, scurvy, and the occasional shark sighting to keep things lively. The convicts, men, women, even some kids, were mostly small-time criminals. Steal a handkerchief? Off to Australia you go. Snatch a sheep? Say hello to 7 years in the outback. Britain's prisons were bursting, and with the American colonies now independent after 1776, they needed a new dumping ground for their undesirables. Australia, with its vast emptiness, at least in British eyes, thanks to Terra Nullius, seemed perfect. When the fleet landed on January 26, 1788, a date now celebrated as Australia Day, though not without controversy, Phillip got to work. Botany Bay, where they first tried to settle, was a bust. The water was scarce, the soil was meh, and the vibe was more swamp than paradise. So, Phillip took one look and said, let's try that other spot James Cook mentioned. Port Jackson was a winner. Deep waters, sheltered coves, and enough fish to keep everyone fed. They set up camp at Sydney Cove, raising a flag and toasting King George III with whatever grog they had left. The convicts, still in chains, probably rolled their eyes, thinking, "Great, now we're stuck in the middle of nowhere." Life in those early days was rougher than a kangaroo's hide. The settlers had brought some supplies, tools, seeds, a few grumpy cows, but the land wasn't exactly welcoming. The soil was stubborn, the climate was brutal, and the local Eora people weren't thrilled about these newcomers trampling their fishing grounds. Philip, to his credit, tried to keep things peaceful. He ordered his men not to shoot unless absolutely necessary, and even befriended a few locals, like Benelong, an Eora man who'd later become a key figure in early cross-cultural exchanges. But misunderstandings were rife. The Eora saw the land as sacred, while the British saw it as a blank canvas for farms and fences. Spoiler: this wouldn't end well. By 1790, Sydney was starting to look like a proper settlement, with crude huts, a governor's house, and fields where convicts toiled under the sun. But food was scarce, and the colony teetered on the brink of starvation. The Second Fleet arrived in 1790, but it was nicknamed the Death Fleet because so many convicts died en route, thanks to dodgy contractors cutting corners on supplies. Philip kept things together, rationing food and cracking down on troublemakers, but it was a close call. Imagine trying to start a new society while everyone's arguing over the last moldy biscuit. That's the First Fleet's legacy, a shaky start to a bold, messy experiment. The convict system: chains, dreams, and second chances. Now, let's talk about the convict system, the backbone of early colonial Australia. Between 1788 and 1868, Britain shipped around 160,000 convicts to Australia. Men, women, and even kids as young as 9. Most weren't hardened criminals. Picture a hungry Londoner swiping a loaf of bread or a seamstress pinching a bolt of cloth to feed her family. In 18th century Britain, where the law was stricter than a school principal, these crimes could earn you a one-way ticket to the other side of the world. 7 years was the standard sentence, but some got 14 or even life. It's like getting grounded for a decade for sneaking a cookie. Life as a convict was no holiday. Imagine being chained below deck for months, seasick and squashed between sweaty strangers, with rats nibbling your rations. Once in Australia, you might be assigned to hard labor, clearing land, building roads, or quarrying stone under a sun that felt like it was trying to cook you. Discipline was harsh. A wrong move could earn you a flogging or worse, a stint in a place like Norfolk Island, a remote prison so brutal it made Sydney look like a spa. Women convicts often worked as servants, cooking or cleaning for officers, though some faced exploitation or worse. Kids, meanwhile, might be sweeping chimneys or running errands, their tiny hands calloused from work. But here's the twist: the convict system wasn't just about punishment. It was also about second chances. Many convicts earned a ticket of leave, a kind of parole that let them work for themselves after proving they could behave. Some even got full pardons, becoming free settlers. Picture a guy who stole a sheep in London now running his own farm in New South Wales, watching his crops grow under a sky full of unfamiliar stars. By 1850, about half of Australia's European population were either convicts or ex-convicts, and they weren't all just toiling in chains. They were building a new society, one back-breaking day at a time. Take Mary Ray Bay, a convict who became a legend. She was just 13 when she got caught stealing a horse in England, probably more of a pony joyride gone wrong, and was shipped to Sydney in 1792. But Mary wasn't one to stay down. She married a ship's officer, Thomas Ray Bay, and after his death, she took over his trading business like a boss. Picture her striding through Sydney's dusty streets, negotiating deals for ships, warehouses, and pubs, all while raising 7 kids. By the 1820s, she was one of the richest women in the colony, owning land, running a shipping empire, and even helping found a bank. Mary's face is on Australia's $20 note today, proof that a convict could outshine the poshest British lord. She's the ultimate underdog story, from horse thief to high society in a land that gave second chances to those who grabbed them. The growth of colonies, from Sydney to the outback. From that shaky start in Sydney, the British got ambitious. They didn't just want a prison camp, they wanted an empire. By 1850, colonies were popping up across Australia like mushrooms after rain. Let's take a tour. In 1803, Tasmania, still called Van Diemen's Land, got its first settlement at Hobart, a place so cold and windy it made Sydney feel tropical. It became a major convict hub, with notorious prisons like Port Arthur, where the cells were so grim you'd confess to anything just for a change of scenery. In 1824, Queensland joined the party with a penal settlement at Moreton Bay, now Brisbane. It was hot, humid, and full of mosquitoes that probably thought convicts were a buffet. By 1829, Western Australia got in on the action with the Swan River Colony, modern Perth, though it wasn't a convict settlement at first. Free settlers tried their luck, only to find the soil as cooperative as a grumpy toddler. South Australia followed in 1836, founded as a free colony for proper British folk who wanted to farm without the convict stigma. Adelaide was their pride and joy, planned with neat streets and lofty ideals, though the reality was more dust and sweat than garden parties. Each colony had its own flavor. Sydney was the rough-and-tumble hub, with markets, taverns, and a mix of convicts, soldiers, and dreamers. Tasmania was the grim prison island, where escapees vanished into the bush, only to be foiled by the wild terrain. Queensland was a frontier, raw and untamed, while South Australia tried to be the posh kid on the block. But they all faced the same challenges: harsh climates, stubborn land, and the tricky task of turning a penal colony into a proper society. Convicts and free settlers cleared forests, built bridges, and planted crops, slowly turning the wilderness into something that looked like home. Imagine a convict, sweat dripping down his face, swinging an axe to clear a path that would one day be a bustling street. That's the grit that built Australia. Clashes with Indigenous peoples, a dark shadow. But let's not sugarcoat it. Colonization came at a brutal cost. The British arrival wasn't just a new chapter for Australia, it was an invasion for the Indigenous peoples. The Eora, Darug, and other groups around Sydney watched as their fishing grounds were fenced off, their sacred sites trampled, and their game driven away by settlers' sheep. The Terra Nullius mindset we talked about last episode meant the British acted like the land was theirs for the taking, ignoring the complex societies that had thrived here for millennia. Early encounters varied. Some Indigenous groups, like Bennelong's clan, traded fish or knowledge with the newcomers, curious about these pale strangers. Bennelong even traveled to England, met the king, and came back wearing a fancy suit. Talk about a glow-up. But peace was fragile. As settlers spread out, taking land for farms and grazing, tensions flared. Skirmishes broke out, often sparked by misunderstandings or outright theft of Indigenous resources. The British had guns, the Indigenous peoples had spears and deep knowledge of the land. Guess who had the upper hand in a fight? These conflicts, later called the Frontier Wars, were scattered but devastating. In Tasmania, the Black War of the 1820s, 1830s saw Indigenous groups fighting to protect their lands, only to be overwhelmed by settlers and soldiers. Disease was another silent killer. Smallpox, brought by Europeans, swept through communities with no immunity, wiping out entire clans. Imagine watching your family, your stories, your way of life vanish under the weight of strangers who don't even see you as people. That's the tragedy of this era, and it's a shadow that looms over Australia's history. Quirky moments. From convict hustle to colonial chaos. Let's lighten things up with some wild stories. Mary Ray Bay wasn't the only convict with a knack for beating the odds. Take James Roos, a farmer who stole corn in England and ended up as Australia's first successful farmer. By 1791, he was growing enough crops to feed himself and others, earning a land grant and a pardon. Picture him hoeing a field, grinning as he realized he'd gone from thief to trailblazer. That's the convict spirit, turning lemons into lemonade, or rather, rocky soil into wheat. Then there's the rum economy. In the early days, Sydney ran on rum like a car runs on petrol. Soldiers and traders used it as currency, bartering for goods or labor. The Rum Corps, a group of soldiers who basically ran the colony like a boozy mafia, got so powerful they overthrew a governor in 1808. Imagine a coup fueled by liquor, it's like a frat party gone rogue. And let's not forget the animals. The British brought cows, sheep, and pigs, but these critters weren't ready for Australia's wilds. Some escaped, turning into feral herds that roamed the bush. Picture a convict chasing a runaway cow through the scrub, cursing as it vanishes into a eucalyptus thicket. Those escapees would later cause headaches, but in the early days, they were a reminder that Australia wasn't going to play by British rules. Historical context: a penal colony with big dreams. Why did Britain pour so much effort into this far-off land? It was all about necessity and ambition. By the late 18th century, British prisons were overflowing, and the American Revolution had cut off their favorite convict dumping ground. Australia was Plan B, a place to banish troublemakers while claiming a strategic foothold in the Pacific. The British weren't just building a jail, they saw potential for farms, ports, and a new jewel in their empire's crown. The convict system was also a social experiment. Britain hoped that hard work and a fresh start would reform criminals into productive citizens. It worked for some, like Mary Ray Bay or James Roos, but others faced brutal conditions and little hope. Meanwhile, the push to colonize clashed with indigenous ways of life, setting the stage for decades of conflict. The frontier wars weren't just skirmishes, they were a fight for survival, identity, and land. This era was also shaped by the Enlightenment's optimism. Governors like Philip believed in order, progress, and the power of hard work. But they underestimated the land's challenges and the resilience of its original inhabitants. By 1850, Australia was no longer just a penal colony. It was a network of settlements with growing towns, farms, and dreams of something bigger. The stage was set for a gold rush that would turn this convict outpost into a global sensation. Picture a land where the red earth hums with ancient stories, where kangaroos bound through the bush and the wind carries the echoes of dreamtime songs. Now imagine that land invaded by newcomers, strangers with guns, fences, and a hunger for territory, trampling sacred sites as if they were just patches of dirt. This is Episode 4, diving into the turbulent period from 1788 to 1900, when European expansion sparked the Frontier Wars, a series of brutal clashes between settlers and Indigenous Australians. We'll walk through the heart-wrenching impact of these conflicts, from Tasmania's devastating Black War to the silent killer of European diseases like smallpox that ravaged communities. We'll see how Indigenous peoples were pushed off their lands, their way of life shattered, yet some, like the fearless Pemulwuy, fought back with courage that still echoes today. It's a story of loss, resistance, and resilience, told with the grit and heart of a land caught in the crossfire. So, let's step into the dust and shadows of the frontier and uncover a chapter that shaped Australia's soul. The Frontier Wars, a clash of worlds. It's 1788, and the British have just planted their flag in Sydney Cove, thinking they found a blank slate for their grand colonial dreams. But this land isn't empty. It's home to tens of thousands of Indigenous Australians, with their songlines, sacred sites, and a way of life honed over 60,000 years. As settlers spread out like ants from a kicked nest, claiming land for farms, sheep, and towns, they collide with the people who've called this place home since the dreamtime. What follows isn't one big war but a series of skirmishes, raids, and battles known as the Frontier Wars, stretching from 1788 to the early 1900s. Think of it as a slow-burning conflict, fought not on battlefields but in the bush, on riverbanks, and across sacred grounds. Picture a settler, axe in hand, clearing eucalyptus trees to make way for a wheat field. To him, it's progress. To the local Darug or Eora people, it's an assault on their hunting grounds, their stories, their very existence. Early encounters were often tense but not always violent. Some indigenous groups traded fish or knowledge with the newcomers, curious about these pale strangers with their odd clothes and clunky boots. But as more settlers arrived, bringing sheep that trampled sacred sites and fences that blocked ancient paths, patience wore thin. A stolen cow here, a speared sheep there, and soon, muskets were answering spears. One of the most brutal chapters unfolded in Tasmania, known then as Van Diemen's Land. By the 1820s, settlers were flooding in, turning lush valleys into grazing lands. The local Palawa people, who'd lived here for millennia, saw their world unravel. The Black War, 1824 to 1831, wasn't a war in the classic sense. No generals, no treaties, but a grim cycle of raids and reprisals. Settlers attacked indigenous camps, often at night, while Palawa warriors struck back, targeting farms and stock. Picture a Palawa hunter, moving silently through the forest, spear in hand, defending his people against invaders who saw him as a shadow to be erased. The British, with guns and numbers, had the upper hand, and the violence was relentless. By 1830, the colonial government tried a desperate plan, the Black Line. Imagine 2,000 settlers, soldiers, and even some convicts forming a human chain across Tasmania, marching to round up the Palawa like cattle. It was a logistical disaster. The line broke apart in the rugged bush, netting just a handful of people, but it showed how far the British would go. By the 1870s, Tasmania's indigenous population was nearly wiped out, with only a few survivors, mostly descendants on the islands of the Bass Strait. It's a gut punch of a story, a stark reminder of what happens when one world steamrolls another. Elsewhere, the story repeated. In New South Wales, the Wiradjuri people clashed with settlers as their lands were carved up for farms. In Queensland, the Kalkadoon fought fiercely in the 1880s, their warriors charging against mounted troopers in a last stand at Battle Mountain. These weren't just fights over land, they were battles for identity, culture, and survival. The indigenous peoples used guerrilla tactics, striking from the bush and vanishing like smoke, but they faced an enemy with endless resources and a belief in their own superiority. The silent killer, European diseases. If the frontier wars were a storm, disease was a silent tsunami. When the first fleet landed, they didn't just bring convicts and dreams. They brought smallpox, influenza, and other germs that indigenous Australians had never encountered. Imagine a community thriving for generations, healthy and strong, suddenly hit by a plague they can't see or fight. Smallpox was the worst. By 1789, just a year after the British arrived, it swept through Sydney's Eora people, leaving bodies piled along the shores. Survivors described it as a great sickness, with entire clans vanishing in weeks. Picture a family by a river, fishing as they've done for centuries, unaware that a settler's cough or a contaminated blanket could bring death. Smallpox spread faster than gossip, carried by trade routes and contact. In some areas, it killed up to 50% of the indigenous population. Other diseases, like measles and tuberculosis, followed, each one chipping away at communities already reeling from land loss and violence. Without immunity, the impact was catastrophic, like a meteor strike on a culture that had flourished for millennia. The diseases didn't just kill bodies, they broke spirits. Elders, the keepers of dreamtime stories and songlines, died before passing on their knowledge. Clans shrank, leaving survivors scattered and vulnerable. Imagine a child, orphaned by smallpox, trying to piece together their people's history from fragments of memory. It's a loss that echoes through generations, a wound that no treaty could heal. Loss of land, the unraveling of a way of life. At the heart of this era's tragedy was the loss of land. For Indigenous Australians, land wasn't just dirt, it was family, history, and spirit. Every hill, river, and tree was part of a living tapestry woven with dreamtime stories. But to the British, it was real estate, ready to be fenced, plowed, and claimed. As settlers spread out, they pushed Indigenous peoples off their ancestral lands, disrupting hunting grounds, sacred sites, and trade routes. Picture a settler driving sheep across a plain where the Ngunnawal once hunted kangaroos. Those sheep trampled plants used for food and medicine, while fences blocked paths to waterholes. Indigenous groups relied on mobility, moving with the seasons to hunt, gather, and perform ceremonies. But as farms and towns sprouted, that freedom vanished. In New South Wales, fertile river valleys became grazing lands. In Victoria, the gold rush of the 1850s brought a flood of diggers, turning sacred sites into mining pits. Imagine standing on a hill, watching your world carved up by strangers who don't even know your name. This wasn't just about losing space, it was about losing a way of life. Without access to hunting grounds, food became scarce. Without sacred sites, ceremonies faltered. Without trade routes, communities grew isolated. Some groups adapted, working as stockmen or guides for settlers, but others were forced into fringes, living on the edges of towns or in makeshift camps. The British offered rations, flour, tea, sugar, but these were poor substitutes for a diet of bush tucker honed over millennia. It's like swapping a gourmet meal for a packet of instant noodles. Heroes of resistance, Penal and the fight for freedom. Amid the loss, there were those who fought back, and none shine brighter than Penal, a Bidjigal warrior from the Sydney area. Picture a man with eyes like fire, moving through the bush like a shadow, spear in hand and a heart full of defiance. From the 1790s to 1802, Penal led a guerrilla campaign against the settlers, raiding farms and burning crops. To the British, he was a troublemaker. To his people, he was a hero, a symbol of resistance against an unstoppable tide. Penal wasn't just throwing spears for the sake of it. He targeted settlers' crops and livestock, knowing that without food, they'd struggle. He united warriors from different clans, a feat that took serious charisma in a world of diverse languages and traditions. Imagine him slipping through the eucalyptus forests, rallying his people with whispers of freedom. The British put a bounty on his head, but he dodged capture for over a decade. Even after his death in 1802, shot by settlers, his spirit lived on. His son, Tedbury, carried on the fight, and Penal's name became a rallying cry for resistance. He wasn't alone. In Tasmania, leaders like Manilurgena and Truganini fought against the odds, leading raids and negotiating with settlers when possible. In Queensland, the Kalkadoon's Battle Mountain stand in 1884 was a desperate, heroic clash against mounted police. These warriors weren't just fighting for land, they were fighting for their stories, their ancestors, their future. Picture a Kalkadoon warrior, standing tall against a horizon filled with troopers, knowing the odds but refusing to bow. That's the kind of courage that burns through history. Quirky moments, survival and defiance in the face of tragedy. Let's sprinkle in some lighter moments, because even in dark times, human spirit finds a way to shine. Take Truganini, often called the last Tasmanian Aborigine, though that's a simplification. She survived the Black War, worked as a mediator between her people and settlers, and even joined a group of Indigenous outlaws for a time, living off the land like a 19th-century Robin Hood. Imagine her striding through Tasmania's wilds, outsmarting settlers with a mix of cunning and charm. Her life was a testament to resilience, even as her world crumbled. Then there's the story of the Black Line in Tasmania. The British thought they could round up the Palawa with a human chain across the island. 2,000 men trudging through the bush, tripping over roots and swearing at the rain. It was less a military triumph and more a comedy of errors, capturing almost no one. Picture a settler, musket in hand, lost in the forest, realizing this grand plan was about as effective as herding cats. And let's not forget the small acts of defiance. Some indigenous groups stole sheep or crops, not just for food but to mess with the settlers. Imagine a warrior sneaking into a paddock at night, leading a sheep away with a grin, knowing it'd drive the farmer nuts. These weren't just pranks, they were ways of saying, "This is still our land." Historical context: the ideology of empire. Why did this happen? It comes down to a toxic mix of greed, power, and a belief in European superiority. The British Empire, at its peak in the 19th century, saw itself as the pinnacle of civilization. Indigenous peoples, with their oral traditions and nomadic lifestyles, didn't fit the British mold of proper society. No farms, no castles, no paperwork. So, they were dismissed as savages, their rights ignored under the Terra Nullius lie we discussed in episode 2. It's like judging a book by its cover, then burning it without reading a page. The British weren't alone in this mindset. Across the globe, European empires were carving up Africa, Asia, and the Americas, fueled by the same ideology. In Australia, settlers had guns, horses, and an endless supply of reinforcements, while indigenous peoples relied on spears, knowledge of the land, and sheer grit. The technological gap was brutal. A spear might be deadly in skilled hands, but it's no match for a musket volley. Add in diseases and land loss, and the odds were stacked like a crooked card game. Yet, this wasn't just about conquest. The British saw Australia as a land of opportunity, a place to build farms, towns, and a new society. But their vision came at a cost, paid by the people who'd lived here for millennia. The frontier wars and their fallout weren't just a chapter in Australia's history. They were a wound that still shapes the nation's soul. The spark that lit the fire. Gold fever takes hold. It's May 1851, and Edward Hargraves, a wiry prospector with a nose for opportunity, is panning in a creek near Bathurst, New South Wales. He swirls his pan, squints at the sediment, and spots a tiny golden speck. "Eureka!" he shouts, or maybe just mutters. "Blimey, that's gold." Word spreads faster than a bushfire in a drought, and within weeks, Australia's got gold fever. Soon, Victoria's fields, Ballarat, Bendigo, Castlemaine, are crawling with diggers, and the gold rush is on, a glittering stampede that'll reshape the continent. Picture a quiet farming town turned upside down. Farmers ditch their plows, shepherds abandon their flocks, and even sailors jump ship, leaving ports like Sydney and Melbourne eerily empty of vessels. The news hits Britain, America, China, and beyond, and suddenly, everyone's booking passage to this land of instant riches. Between 1851 and 1861, Australia's population skyrockets from 400,000 to 1.1 million, like a small town ballooning into a metropolis overnight. Imagine a dusty harbor crammed with ships, disgorging men and women with shovels, dreams, and not much else, all chasing a fortune that might be buried under their boots. The gold wasn't hard to find at first. In Victoria's alluvial gold, nuggets sitting in creeks or shallow soil, was so plentiful that some diggers struck it rich in days. Picture a prospector, knee-deep in mud, pulling out a nugget the size of a hen's egg, laughing like he'd won the lottery. But easy gold didn't last. By the mid-1850s, diggers had to deep mining, hacking through rock with picks and dynamite, sweating in tunnels where the air was thick with dust. It was grueling, dangerous work, and most didn't strike it rich. For every rags-to-riches story, there were dozens of broken dreams, with diggers trudging home penniless, their boots worn to tatters. The gold rush wasn't just about gold, it was about possibility. Convicts, free settlers, and newcomers saw a chance to rewrite their lives. Imagine a former London pickpocket, now a grizzled digger, panning a creek beside a Chinese scholar who left his village for a shot at wealth. This was Australia's melting pot, bubbling with ambition and chaos, where a single nugget could turn a nobody into a somebody, or at least buy a round at the pub. Economic boom. From shanties to shining cities. The gold rush didn't just fill pockets, it supercharged Australia's economy. Picture Melbourne in 1850, a sleepy port with a few brick buildings and muddy streets. By the 1860s, it's a booming metropolis, its skyline sprouting banks, theaters, and grand hotels, all funded by gold. By the 1880s, Melbourne's so flush it's nicknamed Marvelous Melbourne, one of the richest cities in the world, where gaslit streets hum with horse-drawn carriages and fancy folks sip tea in mansions that'd make a British lord jealous. The numbers tell the story. In 1851, Australia's colonies were scraping by, exporting wool and wheat. By 1860, gold was the star, with Victoria alone producing a third of the world's supply. This wasn't just pocket change, it was a windfall that bankrolled everything from schools to shipyards. Imagine a government official, rubbing his hands as gold shipments roll in, dreaming of bridges and railways to stitch the colonies together. Between 1851 and 1870, Australia's economy grew tenfold, pulling the colonies into the global trade network like a ship catching a strong wind. This boom sparked a building frenzy. Roads snaked from goldfields to ports, replacing dusty tracks with gravel and cobblestones. Railways chugged into the outback, their steam whistles echoing like the soundtrack of progress. Ports like Melbourne and Sydney swelled with docks and warehouses, handling ships loaded with tools, clothes, and hopeful migrants. Picture a dockworker, hauling crates of picks and shovels, shouting over the din of sailors and merchants. Towns like Ballarat and Bendigo went from tent camps to proper settlements, with pubs, churches, and even opera houses, because nothing says gold rush like belting out arias in a mining town. The boom wasn't just bricks and mortar. It fueled businesses, from blacksmiths forging picks to bakers feeding hungry diggers. Women ran boarding houses, sewing shops, and grog shanties, turning a profit in a man's world. Imagine a widow, rolling dough in a canvas tent, her bakery the heart of a goldfield camp. The gold rush didn't just make a few miners rich, it built an economy that laid the foundation for modern Australia. Social changes, a new Australia takes shape. The gold rush wasn't just an economic jolt, it reshaped society like a sculptor chiseling a new statue. Before 1851, Australia was a patchwork of convict colonies, with a rigid pecking order. Governors at the top, convicts at the bottom, and free settlers somewhere in between. But gold leveled the playing field, at least for a while. Picture a digger's camp, where a former lord might share a fire with a freed convict, both covered in mud and hoping for a lucky strike. Gold didn't care about your past, only your persistence. This influx of migrants brought a kaleidoscope of cultures. British diggers arrived with Cockney accents and dreams of pubs back home. Americans brought their frontier swagger, teaching Aussies how to swing a pick like a cowboy. Chinese migrants, fleeing poverty and war, poured in by the thousands, their tents dotting the goldfields with splashes of red and gold. By 1855, nearly 20% of Victoria's population was Chinese, a vibrant community that ran noodle shops, herbalist stalls, and even theaters. Imagine a Chinese digger, panning a creek while humming a song from Guangdong, his dreams as big as any Brits. But diversity came with friction. Chinese miners faced ugly prejudice. Their work ethic and success sparked jealousy among European diggers. By the late 1850s, riots broke out, like the Buckland River Clash in 1857, where Chinese camps were burned and miners were driven out. Picture a mob, shouting slurs and wielding clubs, tearing through tents while families fled into the bush. These attacks led to the White Australia Policy's roots, with laws like the 1855 Victorian immigration tax targeting Chinese arrivals. It's a dark stain on the gold rush, a reminder that prosperity didn't mean fairness. The gold rush also accelerated urbanization. Melbourne and Sydney swelled, their streets buzzing with merchants, miners, and mischief. Picture Collins Street in Melbourne, once a dirt track, now lined with banks and boutiques, where diggers in muddy boots gawked at shop windows. Smaller towns like Ballarat became hubs, their pubs packed with storytellers swapping tales of nuggets and near misses. Schools, hospitals, and newspapers sprang up, giving these towns a sense of permanence. Imagine a kid in a new schoolhouse, scribbling on a slate, while outside, his dad dreams of gold. Women played a huge role, though history often overlooks them. Some panned for gold alongside men, their skirts tucked into belts as they sifted creeks. Others ran businesses, from laundries to saloons, or raised families in canvas tents. Picture a woman, balancing a baby on her hip while serving stew to a dozen diggers, her sharp wit keeping rowdy customers in line. The gold rush gave women a chance to carve out independence, even in a world stacked against them. Eureka Stockade, a rebellion for fairness. By 1854, the goldfields were a powder keg. Diggers were fed up with the government's heavy hand, specifically, the miner's license, a tax that cost a fortune whether you found gold or not. Picture a digger, broke and sunburned, handing over his last coins to a smirking trooper checking his license, knowing he might go hungry that night. Add in corrupt officials, brutal police, and a sense that the little guy was getting screwed, and you've got a recipe for rebellion. Enter the Eureka Stockade, a fiery stand in Ballarat, Victoria, that became a symbol of defiance. On December 3, 1854, about 150 diggers, led by Irishman Peter Lawler, built a rough fort of logs and dirt, waving a new flag, the Southern Cross, with stars on a blue field. They swore an oath to fight for fairness, their voices ringing over the dusty plain. Picture Lawler, arm raised, rallying men from Ireland, Italy, and Australia, all united by a shared grudge. They weren't just miners, they were rebels, demanding a voice in a system that ignored them. The government didn't take kindly to this. At dawn, 300 troopers stormed the stockade, their bayonets glinting in the first light. The fight was short but bloody, about 30 diggers and 6 soldiers died, the air thick with smoke and shouts. The stockade fell, but the rebellion's spark didn't. Picture survivors, bloodied but unbowed, dragged to jail while the flag's tattered remnants waved in the breeze. Public outrage followed, with thousands rallying in Melbourne to support the rebels. The government, sensing trouble, reformed the license system, gave miners more rights, and even let them vote. Eureka wasn't just a battle, it was a turning point, a cry for democracy that still echoes in Australia's spirit. Quirky moments, nuggets, riots, and golden tales. Let's toss in some fun stories to keep things lively. Take the welcome stranger, the biggest gold nugget ever found, unearthed in Victoria in 1869. Picture 2 diggers, John Deason and Richard Oates, stumbling over a rock that turned out to be a 72-kilo monster worth a fortune. They had to break it up with a crowbar just to move it, laughing and cursing their luck. That nugget's legend lives on, a reminder that the gold rush could make millionaires out of mud-caked nobodies. Then there's the tale of Canvas Town, a sprawling tent city near Melbourne where thousands of diggers lived in the early 1850s. Picture a sea of canvas, flapping in the wind, with campfires, fiddlers, and hawkers selling everything from pies to picks. It was like a music festival crossed with a mining camp, chaotic and full of life, until proper houses replaced the tents. And let's not forget the gold escorts, armed convoys that carried nuggets from the fields to city vaults. Picture troopers on horseback, muskets ready, eyeing every bush for bushrangers, Australia's answer to highwaymen. These outlaws, like Frank Gardner, became folk heroes, robbing escorts with flair and vanishing into the bush. Imagine a digger at a pub, whispering about a bushranger's latest heist, half scared, half admiring. Historical context, a global stage. Why did the gold rush hit so hard? It was perfect timing. The 1850s were the height of global industrialization, with Britain's factories churning and America's railroads sprawling. Gold was the world's currency, and Australia's fields were a jackpot in a cash-hungry world. The rush coincided with upheavals like the California Gold Rush, 1849, and China's Taiping Rebellion, pushing migrants to seek fortunes abroad. Picture a world map, with arrows pointing to Australia from every corner, as steamships and clippers carried hopefuls to its shores. The gold rush also tied Australia to global trade. Gold funded imports of machinery, clothes, and ideas, while exports of wool and grain grew alongside. The colonies gained clout, demanding more self-rule from Britain. By 1870, Australia wasn't just a penal colony. It was a player on the world stage, its wealth and swagger drawing eyes from London to Shanghai. But this came at a cost. The rush intensified land grabs, pushing indigenous peoples further from their homelands, as we saw in Episode 4. The glitter of gold cast a long shadow. Federation, 6 colonies, 1 nation. It's January 1, 1901, and Sydney's Centennial Park is buzzing like a summer beehive. Thousands of Aussies, farmers in dusty boots, city folk in their Sunday best, and kids waving flags, have gathered under a blazing sun to witness history. The 6 colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania, are officially uniting as the Commonwealth of Australia. Picture a grand ceremony, with brass bands blaring, politicians in top hats puffing out their chests, and a new flag fluttering in the breeze. After decades of squabbling, these colonies have finally agreed to become one nation, with a federal parliament to call the shots. It's like 6 siblings deciding to share a house, complete with arguments over who gets the best room. The road to federation wasn't a stroll in the park. Back in the 1890s, the colonies were like 6 mini-countries, each with its own laws, taxes, and egos. New South Wales thought it was the big boss, Victoria had its gold-fueled swagger, and Queensland was off in its tropical corner, muttering about staying independent. But shared dreams, trade, defense, and a sense of Aussie identity brought them together. Picture delegates in stuffy suits, arguing in smoky rooms over a constitution, fueled by tea and stubbornness. Key players like Henry Parkes, the father of federation, rallied support with speeches that could make a kangaroo stand and salute. By 1899, the colonies voted yes to federation, and Queen Victoria gave her royal nod, probably while sipping tea in Buckingham Palace. The new nation needed a capital, but Sydney and Melbourne both threw tantrums over who'd get the honor. So, they compromised on a patch of sheep paddock halfway between them. Canberra, a planned city that wouldn't exist for years. Picture surveyors in 1908, scratching their heads in the bush, trying to design a capital that'd make both cities jealous. Until Canberra was ready, Melbourne played host to Parliament, its grand buildings echoing with debates about taxes, trade, and what it meant to be Australian. Federation wasn't just about politics. It was about identity. Aussies were starting to see themselves not just as British subjects but as something distinct, with their own slang, swagger, and love for the land. Picture a pub in 1901, where diggers, farmers, and clerks clink glasses, toasting a nation that's theirs, even if it's still tied to Britain's apron strings. The Commonwealth gave Australia a voice, with its own laws and dreams, but it wasn't fully independent. The British Crown still had the final say, like a parent checking your homework. This mix of pride and loyalty set the stage for a nation finding its feet. The White Australia Policy, a dark chapter. Now, let's tackle a tougher topic, the White Australia Policy. Right after Federation, one of the new Parliament's first acts was to pass laws restricting immigration, aiming to keep Australia, well, white. Picture a politician in 1901, standing in Parliament, arguing that Asians, Pacific Islanders, and others don't fit the Australian ideal. It's uncomfortable, but this policy, rooted in the racial prejudices of the time, shaped the nation for decades. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901 wasn't called White Australia outright, but that was the vibe, a legal wall to limit non-European arrivals, especially from China, India, and the Pacific. Why this obsession with a pale population? It goes back to the Gold Rush, Episode 5, when Chinese miners faced riots and resentment despite their hard work. By 1901, fear of foreign competition for jobs, land, or culture was rife. Picture a factory worker in Melbourne, worried that Chinese laborers might take his job for less pay. These fears, stoked by politicians and newspapers, led to laws like the dictation test, where immigrants had to write a passage in any European language an officer chose. Spoiler, if they didn't want you, they'd pick something obscure, like Welsh or Hungarian. It was like a rigged game show, designed to keep non-whites out. The policy wasn't just about new arrivals, it targeted those already here. Pacific Islanders, brought to work Queensland's sugar plantations, were deported under the Pacific Island Labourers Act. Picture families who'd built lives in Australia, forced onto ships, their homes left behind. Chinese communities, vibrant in goldfield towns, shrank as restrictions tightened. The policy wasn't universal. Some Asians and Indigenous people stayed, often slipping through loopholes, but it sent a clear message: Australia wanted a British face. This wasn't unique to Australia. The era was steeped in racial hierarchies, with empires like Britain and the US pushing similar policies. But it's a bitter pill, especially when you think of the diverse diggers who built the nation. Picture a Chinese shopkeeper in Ballarat, reading about the new laws, wondering if his kids will ever be seen as Australian. The White Australia policy lasted until the 1970s, a stain on a nation that prided itself on fairness. It's a reminder that even as Australia grew, it carried the prejudices of its time. ANZACs and World Wars, courage forged in fire. Fast forward to 1914, and the world's about to go haywire. World War I breaks out, and Australia, loyal to Britain, dives in headfirst. Picture young blokes in Sydney and Melbourne, lining up at recruitment offices, their slouch hats tilted with bravado. They're farmers, clerks, and bushmen, eager to prove themselves as Australians while fighting for the empire. By war's end, over 400,000 Aussies enlist, a huge chunk of a 5 million population, forming the Australian Imperial Force, AIF, alongside New Zealanders as the ANZACs, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. The ANZAC's defining moment came in 1915 at Gallipoli, a rocky peninsula in Turkey. Picture a fleet of ships off ANZAC Cove, April 25, 1915, as soldiers scramble down ropes into boats, their hearts pounding as Turkish bullets zip overhead. The plan, cooked up by British generals, was to knock Turkey out of the war by seizing the Dardanelles. But it was a disaster from the start: steep cliffs, entrenched Turks, and chaos on the beaches. The ANZACs fought like lions, digging trenches under relentless fire, their mates falling beside them. Picture a young digger, clutching his rifle in a muddy trench, writing a letter home by candlelight, promising his mum he'll be back for Christmas. Gallipoli was a bloodbath. Over 8 months, Australia lost more than 8,000 men, with 18,000 wounded. The campaign failed, and the ANZACs evacuated in December 1915, leaving behind graves and a legend. Picture a soldier, slipping away under cover of darkness, glancing back at the cliffs where so many mates stayed forever. Gallipoli wasn't a victory, but it forged a national identity. The ANZAC's courage, mateship, and dry humor, cracking jokes even as shells rained down, became the stuff of Aussie pride. April 25th, ANZAC Day, is still a sacred holiday, with dawn services across Australia honoring those who fell. Imagine standing in the pre-dawn chill, hearing the last post, feeling the weight of a nation's gratitude. The ANZACs kept fighting, on the Western Front in France and in the Middle East. Picture them charging at Fromelles in 1916, or riding camels with a light horse at Beersheba in 1917, their slouch hats cutting a dashing silhouette. They earned a reputation as tough, reliable fighters, but the cost was staggering. Over 60,000 Australians died in the war, a gut punch for a young nation. Yet, it cemented Australia's place on the world stage, proving it was more than a British outpost. World War II hit closer to home. In 1939, Australia joined the fight against Germany, sending troops to North Africa and Greece. Picture Aussie rats of Tobruk, holding a Libyan port against Nazi tanks in 1941, their defiance earning global respect. But when Japan entered the war, the stakes skyrocketed. By 1942, Japanese bombs were falling on Darwin, and Singapore, a British stronghold, collapsed, leaving thousands of Aussie POWs in brutal camps. Imagine a Darwin resident, ducking for cover as air raid sirens wail, realizing the war's no longer over there. Australia turned to America for help, with U.S. troops flooding Sydney and Brisbane. Picture GIs and Aussies sharing beers in pubs, swapping stories of baseball and cricket. The Battle of the Coral Sea and the Kokoda Track Campaign in Papua New Guinea, where Aussies and locals fought side by side in jungle hell, stopped Japan's advance. Picture a digger, slogging through mud, malaria biting at his heels, knowing home's just over the horizon. By 1945, Australia had lost 39,000 lives, but its role in the Pacific cemented its strategic importance. The wars showed Australia could stand tall, even as it mourned. Quirky moments, from slouch hats to stolen hearts. Let's lighten the mood with some fun stories. Take the slouch hat, the ANZAC's iconic headgear. Picture a soldier tilting his hat just so, one side pinned up for a rakish look. It wasn't just style, it kept rain off faces and doubled as a water scoop in the desert. The hat became a symbol of Aussie spirit, worn with pride from Gallipoli to Kokoda. Then there's the tale of the Emu War. Yes, really. In 1932, Western Australian farmers, fed up with emus eating their crops, called in the army. Picture soldiers with machine guns, chasing giant birds across the outback, only to realize emus are faster and sneakier than expected. The war was a flop, with the emus declared the winners. It's like a Looney Tunes episode, but with real bullets and feathers flying. And let's not forget the wartime romance. During World War II, American GIs charmed Aussie women with their accents and nylon stockings, a rare luxury. Picture a dance hall in Brisbane, with jitterbugging couples and local blokes grumbling about Yankee invaders. Thousands of war brides sailed to the U.S. after the war, their hearts stolen by men in uniform. Historical context: a nation in a changing world. Why did these years matter? Federation was Australia's coming of age, a push for self-rule after decades of colonial dependence. The colonies wanted control over trade, defense, and identity, but loyalty to Britain kept them tethered, like a teenager with a curfew. The White Australia policy reflected the era's global racism, with nations like Canada and South Africa also favoring European immigrants. It was a product of fear and arrogance, clashing with Australia's growing diversity. The world wars were a crucible. World War I, sparked by a Balkan assassination, dragged empires into chaos, and Australia's loyalty to Britain pulled it along. Gallipoli's failure exposed British blunders, nudging Australia toward independence. World War II, with its Pacific threat, forced Australia to rethink its alliances, leaning on America while still saluting Britain. These wars shaped a national character, tough, loyal, with a streak of larrikin humor, and gave Australia a louder voice in global affairs. Economically, the early 20th century was a roller coaster. The 1900s saw wool and wheat boom, but the Great Depression of the 1930s hit hard, with soup kitchens in Sydney and shantytowns in Melbourne. Picture a family, queuing for bread, their pride battered but unbroken. Recovery came with war production, as factories churned out tanks and planes, setting the stage for post-war growth. A new era dawns, migration and a changing nation. It's 1945, and the world is catching its breath after the chaos of World War II. Australia, with its sun-drenched shores and sprawling outback, is ready to reinvent itself. The war's over, but the nation's got big plans. Build a bigger population, boost the economy, and shake off the old British colony label. Enter the great post-war migration wave, a human tide that'll transform Australia from a mostly Anglo outpost into a vibrant mosaic of cultures. Picture a Sydney dock in 1947, where ships unload thousands of Italians, Greeks, and Yugoslavs, their suitcases stuffed with dreams and a few family recipes. These new Australians, as the government calls them, are here to work, build, and add their flavors to the national stew. The government's mantra is, populate or perish. After Japan's attacks on Darwin and the Pacific threat, Australia's 7 million people feel like a drop in the ocean. Prime Minister Ben Chifley and Immigration Minister Arthur Calwell roll out a bold plan. Bring in 70,000 migrants a year, mostly from Europe. Picture a recruitment poster in war-torn Italy, promising jobs and sunshine. By the 1950s, over 2 million arrive. Italians planting vineyards in Victoria, Greeks opening cafes in Melbourne, and Dutch carpenters hammering away in Perth. Imagine an Italian nana, kneading dough in a suburban kitchen, teaching her Aussie neighbors the art of pasta while her kids play cricket in the street. The 1970s bring a seismic shift. The White Australia policy, that ugly relic of racial bias we discussed in Episode 6, gets the boot. Prime Minister Gough Whitlam and his successors dismantle the dictation tests and quotas, opening the door to migrants from Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. Picture a Vietnamese family, fleeing war in 1975, stepping onto Sydney's shores, their fishing boat swapped for a new life. By the 1990s, Lebanese, Indian, and Chinese communities are thriving, their restaurants, festivals, and traditions weaving into Australia's fabric. Sydney's Chinatown buzzes with noodle shops, while Melbourne's Ligon Street smells like espresso and souvlaki. This isn't just migration, it's a cultural revolution, turning Australia into one of the world's most diverse nations. But it's not all smooth sailing. Some Aussies, used to fish and chips, grumble about foreign faces and flavors. Picture a pub in the 1950s, where old-timers mutter about wogs, a slur for Southern Europeans, taking jobs. Anti-Asian sentiment flares in the 1980s, with debates about too many migrants. Yet, the newcomers keep coming, their resilience outshining the prejudice. Imagine a Greek migrant, opening a fruit shop despite the cold stares, his kids growing up to be doctors and MPs. By 2000, over 20% of Australians are born overseas, and multiculturalism is the new normal, a messy, vibrant normal that's uniquely Aussie. The stolen generations, a national shame. Now, let's face a darker chapter, the stolen generations. From the late 1800s to the 1970s, Australian governments enforced policies to assimilate Indigenous children by forcibly removing them from their families. Picture a dusty outback community in the 1950s, where a government truck rolls in, and officials snatch kids from their mother's arms, claiming it's for their own good. These children, often of mixed Aboriginal and European descent, were sent to missions, orphanages, or white foster homes, stripped of their culture, language, and identity. Imagine a young girl, clutching a rag doll, crying as she's driven away from her mob, her dreamtime stories fading with each mile. The logic was cruel: civilize Indigenous kids by raising them white. Mission dormitories drilled Christianity and English, punishing kids for speaking their native tongues. Picture a boy, whispering a lullaby from his country, only to be slapped for talking black fella. Many faced abuse, neglect, or worse. Some were told their families were dead, others were adopted out, their roots erased. The impact was devastating. Families torn apart, communities gutted, and a generation left with scars that wouldn't heal. By the 1970s, an estimated 10 to 30% of Indigenous children were taken, a wound that still bleeds in Australia's heart. The truth came to light slowly. In the 1990s, the Bringing Them Home report exposed the horror, with survivors sharing stories that broke the nation's silence. Picture a hearing room, where a woman, now middle-aged, recounts her stolen childhood, her voice trembling but strong. In 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd stood in Parliament and said, "Sorry." Imagine Indigenous elders in the gallery, tears streaming, as a nation finally acknowledged their pain. The apology didn't erase the past, but it was a step toward healing, a promise to listen and learn. The Stolen Generation's legacy is a call to confront hard truths and build a better future. Economic boom, riding the resource wave. While migration reshaped Australia's soul, its economy was hitting the big leagues. Post-war Australia wasn't just a land of beaches and barbecues, it was sitting on a treasure chest of natural resources. Picture the Pilbara region in Western Australia, where red earth hides mountains of iron ore, or Queensland's Bowen Basin, stuffed with coal. By the 1960s, these riches were fueling a boom that made Australia one of the world's wealthiest nations. Imagine a mining town, where diggers in hard hats load ore onto trains longer than a footy field, bound for ports and ships to Japan, China, and beyond. The boom kicked off in the 1950s, as global demand for steel and energy soared. Japan's post-war rebuild was a game-changer. Picture Tokyo's factories hungry for Aussie iron and coal. By the 1970s, mining was Australia's golden goose, with exports driving GDP growth. Cities like Perth and Brisbane sprouted skyscrapers, their glass towers reflecting a new confidence. Imagine a stockbroker in Sydney, grinning as resource stocks soar, while farmers in the outback watch their wool and wheat fetch top dollar. The economy wasn't just growing, it was sprinting, with unemployment low and wages high. This wealth funded a suburban dream. Picture new neighborhoods in Melbourne, with brick houses, neat lawns, and Holden cars in every driveway. The Snowy Mountains scheme, a massive hydroelectric project, was a symbol of this ambition. Imagine Italian and Yugoslav migrants, blasting tunnels through mountains, their sweat building dams that powered a nation. By the 1980s, Australia's living standards rivaled Europe's, with free healthcare, education, and a lifestyle that screamed, "Lucky country." But the boom had shadows. Mining scarred Indigenous lands, often without consent. Picture a sacred site, bulldozed for a coal pit, its stories buried under rubble. Workers faced danger, cave-ins, dust, and long hours, while small farmers struggled as global prices fluctuated. The economy was a juggernaut, but not everyone rode the wave. The 1967 referendum, a step toward justice. One of the era's brightest moments was the 1967 referendum, a landmark for Indigenous rights. Before this, Indigenous Australians were excluded from the census and lacked federal protections, treated like shadows in their own land. Picture a 1960s activist, like Faith Bandler, rallying crowds with speeches that could move mountains, demanding equality. The referendum asked Aussies to let the federal government make laws for Indigenous people and count them in the census. Simple, but revolutionary. On May 27, 1967, over 90% of voters said, yes, a thunderous cry for change. Picture a remote Indigenous community, where elders hear the news by radio, their faces lighting up with hope. The referendum didn't grant voting rights, most already had them by state laws, but it gave Indigenous Australians a place in the national story. It also empowered federal laws, like the 1975 Racial Discrimination Act, to fight inequality. Imagine a young Indigenous kid, now counted as an Australian, dreaming of a future where his voice matters. The victory was a spark, igniting the land rights movement and leaders like Eddie Mabwa, who'd fight for native title in the 1990s. Sydney Opera House, a cultural icon rises. If there's one image that screams Australia to the world, it's the Sydney Opera House. Opened in 1973, this architectural marvel, with its white sails glowing against the harbour, became a symbol of a nation embracing its creativity. Picture the 1957 design competition, where Danish architect Jorn Utsen's wild sketch, like seashells or ship sails, beat out hundreds. Construction was a saga, budget blowouts, political spats, and Utsen storming off in 1966, leaving Aussies to finish his masterpiece. Imagine workers on scaffolds, piecing together 1 million ceramic tiles, cursing the wind but crafting a wonder. The opening, with fireworks and Queen Elizabeth II cutting the ribbon, was a global spectacle. Picture the first performance, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, echoing through halls packed with proud locals. The Opera House wasn't just a building, it was a statement that Australia could dream big, blending European flair with Aussie boldness. Today, it hosts operas, rock gigs, and Indigenous dance, a stage for the nation's multicultural heart. Imagine standing on its steps, the harbour sparkling, knowing this is Australia's gift to the world. Quirky moments, from Vegemite to multicultural mischief. Let's toss in some fun stories. Vegemite, that salty spread Aussies adore, became a post-war icon. Picture kids in the 1950s, slathering it on toast, their faces scrunching at the taste but loving it anyway. It was the ultimate comfort food, a taste of home for migrants learning to call Australia theirs. Then there's the multicultural food revolution. In the 1950s, Italian espresso machines hissed in Melbourne cafes, shocking Aussies used to instant coffee. By the 1980s, Vietnamese pho and Lebanese kebabs were street food staples. Imagine a Greek festival in Sydney, with souvlaki sizzling and dancers spinning, while locals join in, their hips not quite mastering the moves. And let's not forget the 1956 Melbourne Olympics, the first in the Southern Hemisphere. Picture athletes from 67 nations competing, while Aussies cheered their 13 gold medals. The friendly games had drama. A Hungarian-Soviet water polo match turned bloody over Cold War tensions, but showed Australia could host the world. Historical context. A global player. Why did this era matter? Post-war Australia was shedding its colonial skin, driven by global shifts. The US replaced Britain as the key ally, with ANZAC treaties and cultural imports like rock and roll. Picture teens jiving to Buddy Holly, their parents tootling at Yankee nonsense. Globalization tied Australia to Asia, with trade booming as Japan and China grew. The Cold War's shadow, think Vietnam War protests in the 1970s, pushed Australia to define its role in a divided world. Economically, resources and migration fueled growth, but the 1970s brought oil shocks and inflation. Socially, the 1960s counterculture and 1970s feminism shook norms. Picture women marching for equal pay, their banners bold, while Indigenous activists chained themselves to Parliament for land rights. Australia was becoming a multicultural, middle-class powerhouse, but its past, especially Indigenous wrongs, demanded reckoning. A new millennium. Australia in the 21st century. It's the year 2000, and Australia is basking in the glow of a new millennium. Sydney's Olympic Games have just dazzled the world, with athletes sprinting under a sky lit by fireworks, and the nation's feeling pretty chuffed about its place on the global stage. Fast forward to 2025, and Australia's a vibrant, complex tapestry, weaving together over 30% of its population born overseas, facing the heat of climate change, and wrestling with its past to forge a fairer future for Indigenous peoples. Picture Sydney's bustling streets, where Vietnamese pho shops sit beside Lebanese bakeries, and the air hums with accents from every corner of the globe. This is modern Australia, a land of diversity, resilience, and big questions. In this episode, we'll dive into the years from 2000 to 2025, exploring how multiculturalism shapes the nation's soul, how climate crises like the Black Summer fires test its spirit, and how debates over Indigenous recognition, like the 2023 voice referendum, reflect a nation seeking reconciliation. We'll also surf the waves of Bondi Beach, marvel at the Great Barrier Reef's fragile beauty, and crack a smile at the dry, self-deprecating humor that defines Aussie culture. So, grab a flat white, and let's journey through the heart of contemporary Australia. Multiculturalism, a nation of many voices. If Australia's history is a quilt, the 21st century has added the boldest, brightest patches yet. By 2025, over 30% of Australians were born overseas, making the country one of the world's most diverse. Picture Melbourne's Dandenong Market, where stalls overflow with Somali samosas, Indian curries, and Turkish baklava, and shoppers banter in a dozen languages. This multiculturalism, seated in the post-war migrations of Episode 7, has bloomed into a defining trait. Since the White Australia policy was scrapped in the 1970s, waves of migrants from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East have reshaped the nation. Imagine a Sudanese refugee family in Adelaide, opening a cafe that becomes a local hotspot, their kids acing school while teaching mates how to make injera. The numbers tell a story. By 2020, nearly half of Australians had at least one parent born overseas. Sydney and Melbourne are global melting pots, with suburbs like Parramatta boasting communities from India, China, and the Philippines. Picture a Diwali festival in Sydney, with lanterns glowing and Bollywood beats pulsing, drawing crowds of every background. Schools teach Mandarin alongside English, and Lunar New Year parades rival Christmas for sparkle. This diversity isn't just window dressing, it's economic rocket fuel. Migrants start businesses, fill skills gaps, and keep Australia competitive. Imagine a tech startup in Brisbane, founded by a Vietnamese coder and an Iranian engineer, their app going global. But multiculturalism isn't a fairy tale. Tensions flare, especially when economic or global fears bubble up. Picture a 2005 riot on Cronulla Beach, where Anglo and Lebanese youths clashed, fueled by post-9/11 mistrust. Anti-immigrant rhetoric spikes during elections, with some politicians stoking fears of overcrowding. Yet, Australia's commitment to inclusion shines through. Policies like multicultural grants fund community festivals, and TV shows feature diverse faces, from Indigenous comedians to Somali chefs. Imagine a reality cooking show, where a Sri Lankan grandma's curry wins hearts, proving food speaks louder than prejudice. By 2025, multiculturalism is Australia's superpower, a messy, vibrant strength that sets it apart. Ecological challenges, fire, flood, and a reef in peril. Australia's beauty is legendary, but it's under siege. Climate change is no distant threat here. It's a roaring reality, with bushfires, droughts, and dying corals reshaping the land. Picture the summer of 2019 to 2020, dubbed Black Summer, when bushfires tore through 24 million hectares, an area bigger than the UK. Imagine families fleeing their homes in New South Wales, skies glowing orange, and kangaroos silhouetted against flames. Over 3 billion animals perished or were displaced, and 34 people lost their lives. Communities rallied. Picture volunteer firefighters, faces smeared with ash, battling blazes while neighbors cooked meals for evacuees. The world watched, stunned, as Australia burned, a stark warning of climate change's fury. The Great Barrier Reef, the world's largest coral system, is another casualty. Stretching 2,300 kilometers off Queensland, it's a kaleidoscope of color, home to 1,500 fish species and countless corals. Picture snorkeling over reefs teeming with clownfish, their anemone homes swaying in the current. But warming oceans and acidification are killing corals, with bleaching events in 2016, 2017, and 2020 turning vibrant reefs ghostly white. Imagine a marine biologist diving to survey damage, her heart sinking as she sees coral skeletons where life once thrived. By 2025, over half the reef's corals are gone, despite efforts like coral planting and pollution controls. It's a race against time, with global emissions cuts the only real fix. Climate change also brings floods and droughts. Picture Queensland in 2011, where floods submerged towns, or the Murray-Darling Basin, where farmers watch crops wither in endless dry spells. Australia's fighting back, renewable energy like solar farms dots the outback, and cities aim for net zero emissions. Imagine a wind turbine spinning in South Australia, powering homes while cutting coal's grip. But the challenges are huge, and public pressure is mounting. Picture climate marches in Sydney, where kids with placards demand a future. Australia's natural wonders are its heartbeat, and saving them is a national mission. Reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. A long road. Australia's journey to reconcile with its Indigenous peoples is a story of progress, setbacks, and hope. After centuries of dispossession, from the Frontier Wars, Episode 4, to the Stolen Generations, Episode 7, the 21st century sees renewed efforts to right wrongs. Picture Uluru, glowing red at sunset, where Anangu elders share stories, their voices carrying 60,000 years of wisdom. Recognition of Indigenous rights, to land, culture, and a voice, is at the heart of this era. Land rights have gained ground since the 1992 Mabwa decision, which overturned Terra Nullius. By 2025, over 50% of Australia's land is under Indigenous ownership or claim, from Arnhem Land to the Kimberley. Picture a ranger program in Kakadu, where Indigenous youth manage country, blending ancient knowledge with modern science. Native title isn't perfect, mining companies often hold sway, but it's a step toward justice. Imagine an elder handing a spear to her grandson, knowing their land is legally theirs again. The biggest debate is constitutional recognition. Picture activists in the 2010s, pushing for Indigenous voices in Parliament, culminating in the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart. This powerful call for a First Nations voice, a body to advise on Indigenous issues, and a truth-telling process inspired hope. Imagine 250 Indigenous leaders gathered at Uluru, their words echoing across the nation. But the 2023 referendum to enshrine the voice failed, with 60% voting no, amid misinformation and fear of division. Picture a community center in Alice Springs, where Indigenous voters watch results, their disappointment palpable but their resolve unbroken. The defeat sparked debates, with some calling for grassroots action over political promises. Reconciliation is more than laws. Picture NAIDOC Week, where schools hoist Aboriginal flags and communities celebrate Indigenous art, from dot paintings to hip-hop. Cultural centers like Melbourne's Corey Heritage Trust preserve stories, while TV shows like Black Comedy bring Indigenous humor to screens. Imagine a non-Indigenous Aussie learning a welcome to country ceremony, feeling a deeper connection to the land. Yet, gaps persist. Indigenous Australians face higher incarceration and lower life expectancy. Closing these gaps is a shared challenge, a test of Australia's heart. Economic resilience. Dodging the global financial crisis. Australia's economy in the 21st century is a global standout. Picture the 2008 financial crisis, when banks collapsed worldwide, but Australia kept humming, avoiding recession thanks to a mining boom and smart policy. Imagine a Perth mine, where trucks haul iron ore for China's skyscrapers, keeping jobs and dollars flowing. Strong exports, iron, coal, gas, and a banking system stricter than a school principal meant Australia weathered the storm. By 2010, while Europe and the US reeled, Aussies were still buying flat-screen TVs and beach houses. This resilience continued, with Australia's GDP per capita among the world's highest by 2025. Picture Sydney's skyline, its towers gleaming with wealth from tech, education, and tourism. International students from India and China fill universities, their fees funding research. But cracks exist, housing costs soar, pricing young Aussies out, and inequality grows. Imagine a barista in Melbourne, juggling 2 jobs to afford rent, while mining execs sip wine in penthouses. The economy's a juggernaut, but balancing growth with fairness is the trick. Cultural and natural icons, surf, reefs, and sass. Australia's culture is as bold as its landscapes. Picture Bondi Beach, where surfers carve waves at dawn, their boards slicing through turquoise water. Surfing's more than a sport, it's a lifestyle, with coastal towns like Byron Bay pulsing with laid-back vibes. Imagine a surf shop, its walls plastered with boards, where locals swap stories of epic rides. Beach culture shapes Aussie identity, from barbecues, Barbies, to lifesavers patrolling shores. Picture a family on Manly Beach, kids building sandcastles, parents slathering sunscreen, all under a sky that screams summer. The Great Barrier Reef, though, is a bittersweet jewel. Its corals, once a riot of color, are fading, but it's still a global wonder. Picture a tourist boat off Cairns, where diverse marvel at turtles and rays, even as scientists warn of bleaching. Conservation efforts, like coral nurseries and marine parks, fight to save it, a symbol of Australia's environmental resolve. Imagine a volunteer, planting coral fragments, hoping they'll grow into a new reef. Aussie humor ties it all together. Picture a pub in Perth, where mates trade barbs, their sarcasm sharper than a boomerang. Words like mate, friend or stranger, Barbie, barbecue, and Arvo, afternoon pepper conversations, while shows like Kath and Kim mock suburban life with wicked wit. Imagine a comedian, roasting politicians with a grin, the crowd howling at the self-deprecating jab. This humor, dry, egalitarian, and a bit cheeky, is Australia's cultural glue, cutting through pomp and keeping it real. Quirky moments. From Olympics to outback oddities. Let's sprinkle in some fun. The 2000 Sydney Olympics were a high point, with 3.7 million tickets sold and Aussie athletes like Ian Thorpe, the Torpedo, swimming to gold. Picture the opening ceremony, with a giant fish and Indigenous performers, showing Australia's heart to the world. It was a party that said, "We've arrived." Then there's the 2011 Census Night saga, when Aussies jokingly listed Jedi as their religion, crashing the website. Imagine a geek in Canberra, chuckling as he types Yoda into the form, part of a prank that became a cultural meme. It's peak Aussie, irreverent and playful. And don't forget the Outback's quirks. Picture the Birdsville races, a horse race in a desert town, where thousands converge for beer, bets, and dust. It's like Woodstock with Akubras, a celebration of Australia's wild spirit. Historical context. A Pacific power. Modern Australia balances prosperity with purpose. Economically, it's a Pacific powerhouse, with trade ties to China, Japan, and ASEAN. Picture a trade summit in Canberra, where deals on lithium and green tech shape global markets. Geopolitically, Australia navigates US-China tensions, its AUKUS pact boosting defense. Socially, it's a leader in diversity, but debates over migration and Indigenous rights reflect growing pains. Picture a 2020 Black Lives Matter rally, where Indigenous and multicultural Aussies march together, demanding change. Climate change is the defining challenge. Australia's coal reliance clashes with its renewable push, while Pacific neighbors beg for action as seas rise. The 2009 Copenhagen Summit and 2015 Paris Agreement put Australia in the spotlight, its policies scrutinized. Culturally, globalization brings K-pop and TikTok, but Aussie stories, from Mad Max to Indigenous art, hold strong. This era is about finding balance in a world that's connected yet divided. Weaving the threads of a nation. Here we are, at the end of our journey through Australia's remarkable story, standing on the edge of a land where the red dust of the outback meets the turquoise waves of the Pacific. From the ancient songlines of indigenous peoples to the creaking sails of European ships, from the clink of convict chains to the glitter of gold, Australia's history is a tapestry of contrasts, woven with triumph, tragedy, and transformation. In this final episode, we'll reflect on the sweeping arc of Australia's past, from the world's oldest continuous culture to a modern, multicultural powerhouse. We'll trace the scars left by colonization and the resilience of indigenous communities, celebrate the vibrant mosaic of migrant stories, and look to the challenges of safeguarding a unique natural heritage in a warming world. This is a story of a nation that's as complex as its coral reefs, as bold as its bushrangers, and as enduring as Uluru itself. So, let's gather by a virtual campfire, under a sky full of stars, and unravel the threads that make Australia's identity so extraordinary. The ancient heart. Indigenous foundations. Australia's story begins with the world's oldest living culture, a heritage stretching back over 60,000 years. Picture the vast, sun-baked plains where Indigenous Australians walked, their feet tracing songlines that mapped the land's stories, seasons, and sacred sites. From the Eora of Sydney's harbours to the Anangu of Uluru's Red Heart, these First Nations thrived in harmony with a land that was family, not property. Imagine elders by a fire, sharing dreamtime tales of the rainbow serpent or the seven sisters, weaving knowledge that guided hunting, healing, and ceremony. This ancient foundation shaped Australia's soul. Indigenous practices like firestick farming sculpted landscapes, sustaining biodiversity long before European plows arrived. Picture controlled burns, their smoke curling like a prayer, ensuring kangaroos and yams flourished. Art, from rock paintings to bark canvases, told stories that outlasted empires, while languages, over 250 at contact, carried wisdom as rich as any library. Even today, Indigenous place names like Canberra, Meeting Place, and Parramatta, Place of Eels, echo across the nation, a reminder of a culture that endures. But this heart was wounded. European arrival in 1788, as we saw in Episode 2, brought Terra Nullius, a lie that erased Indigenous ownership. The Frontier Wars, Episode 4, smallpox and land theft shattered communities, yet resilience shone through. Picture Penal's Defiance or the 1967 referendum's triumph, steps toward justice. By 2025, as explored in Episode 8, native title claims cover half the land, and cultural revival, from NAIDOC Week to Indigenous-led ranger programs, pulses strong. Australia's Indigenous heritage is its deepest root, a source of pride and a call to reconcile past wrongs. The Colonial crucible. From chains to nationhood. Enter the Europeans, their sails cutting the horizon like a new chapter's opening line. The First Fleet's arrival in 1788, detailed in Episode 3, marked Australia as a British penal colony, a dumping ground for petty thieves like Mary Ray Bay, who'd later conquer commerce. Picture convicts toiling under a merciless sun, building Sydney's first streets, their sweat mingling with dreams of freedom. The convict era wasn't just punishment, it was a forge, shaping a society where second chances turned thieves into farmers, like James Roos, and laid the foundations for a new world. Colonization spread like wildfire, with settlements sprouting in Tasmania, Queensland, and beyond. But it came at a brutal cost. Picture Indigenous clans, pushed from their lands, their songlines severed by fences. The gold rush of the 1850s, as we saw in Episode 5, supercharged this expansion, turning Melbourne into a global gem while intensifying land grabs. The Eureka Stockade's rebel flag waved for fairness, a spark of the egalitarianism that would define Australia. By 1901, as explored in Episode 6, Federation united 6 colonies into a nation, with Canberra's planned streets symbolizing a bold future. Yet, the White Australia policy cast a shadow, a reminder that progress often carried prejudice. This colonial crucible forged a national character. Tough, resourceful, with a streak of larrikin humor. Picture a bushman in a slouch hat, cracking a joke as he herds sheep, or ANZACs at Gallipoli, their mateship shining through the mud. Australia's journey from chains to nationhood was messy, marked by ambition and injustice, but it built a foundation that would weather world wars and welcome new voices. The multicultural mosaic, a nation of newcomers. Australia's identity is a kaleidoscope, its colors enriched by waves of migrants. From the post-war Italians and Greeks of Episode 7 to the Vietnamese and Indians of the 21st century, newcomers have reshaped the nation. Picture Sydney's Chinatown in 2025, its lanterns glowing as families celebrate Lunar New Year, or Melbourne's souvlaki stalls buzzing with festival-goers. By Episode 8, we saw over 30% of Australians born overseas, their businesses, cuisines, and stories fueling a multicultural boom. Imagine a Somali cafe in Perth, where locals learn to love Berbera spices, or a Filipino nurse in Brisbane, saving lives while teaching colleagues a karaoke classic. This diversity wasn't always easy. The White Australia policy, born in 1901, slammed doors on non-Europeans until its end in the 1970s. Picture the 2005 Cronulla riots, a flare-up of tension, or the 1980s debates over Asian migration. Yet, Australia chose inclusion, with policies celebrating cultural festivals and schools teaching Mandarin. The triumph of migrants, from Greek shopkeepers to Sudanese doctors, mirrors the convict spirit. Take a chance, work hard, and thrive. Imagine a Diwali party in Adelaide, where Anglo, Indigenous, and Indian Aussies dance together, proof that diversity is Australia's strength. This mosaic reflects a globalized world, where Australia's trade with Asia and cultural imports like K-pop shape its vibe. Picture a teen in Darwin, scrolling TikTok for Korean dance moves, her life as connected to Seoul as Sydney. Multiculturalism isn't just a policy, it's the heartbeat of modern Australia, a testament to a nation that's learned to embrace difference. The environmental imperative, a land under pressure. Australia's natural beauty is its crown, from the Great Barrier Reef's coral wonderland to the outback's endless red horizons. Picture Bondi Beach, where surfers chase waves, or Kakadoo's wetlands, alive with crocodiles and birds. These wonders, celebrated in Episode 8, are woven into Australia's identity, fueling a beach culture of Barbies and bronzed lifesavers. But they're under threat. Climate change, as we saw, brings fire, flood, and fading reefs. Imagine the black summer of 2019 to 2020, with skies choked by smoke, or a diver off cairns, mourning bleached corals. This environmental challenge is Australia's modern frontier. Picture solar farms in the desert, their panels gleaming like a promise, or Indigenous rangers in Arnhem Land, using traditional burns to protect country. Australia's a leader in renewables, yet its coal exports spark debate. Imagine a climate rally in Melbourne, where kids demand action, their signs as bold as Eureka's flag. The Great Barrier Reef's fight for survival is a global symbol, urging Australia to balance its mining wealth with a green future. Picture a scientist, planting coral, her hope as stubborn as the land itself. This struggle echoes Australia's history of resilience. Just as convicts turned rocky soil into farms, and migrants built lives from scratch, Aussies face climate change with grit. The land that shaped their identity now asks them to protect it, a challenge as defining as any in their past. The soul of a nation, contrasts and unity. Australia's story is one of contrasts, each chapter leaving its mark. Picture the tragedy of the stolen generations, explored in Episode 7, alongside the 2008 apology, a moment of national reckoning. Imagine the 2023 voice referendum's defeat, a setback, yet Indigenous artists like Archie Roach keep culture alive, their songs carrying hope. The nation's pride in its diversity, from Diwali to NAIDOC, contrasts with past prejudices, like the White Australia policy. Its economic might, dodging the 2008 crisis, stands against the inequality faced by some. And its natural splendor, from reefs to rainforests, battles human impact. Yet, these contrasts forge unity. Australia's identity is egalitarian, born in the goldfields and ANZAC trenches, where a fair go became a creed. Picture a pub in 2025, where a miner, a migrant chef, and an Indigenous elder share a beer, their laughter bridging worlds. Aussie humor dry, self-deprecating, with a love for mate and arvo, glues it together. Imagine a comedian at the Sydney Opera House, poking fun at politicians, the crowd roaring with shared delight. This humor, like the land, is enduring, cutting through hardship with a grin. Australia's triumphs, federation, multiculturalism, economic resilience, shine beside its tragedies, from Indigenous dispossession to environmental strain. Picture the 1967 referendum, a landslide for rights, or the Sydney Olympics, a global party. Each moment, light or dark, builds a nation that's proud, reflective, and forward-looking. Looking forward, a nation's next chapter. As we close this series, Australia stands at a crossroads. Picture a young Indigenous leader in 2025, advocating for truth-telling, her voice echoing the Uluru Statement. Imagine a scientist in Perth, designing green tech to cool a warming planet, or a migrant family in Canberra, their kids dreaming big in a land of opportunity. Australia's future hinges on balancing its economic strength with social justice and environmental care. Will it lead the Pacific in climate action? Will it enshrine Indigenous voices? Will its diversity keep thriving? The nation's history offers clues. From Pemulwuy's resistance to Mary Raby's hustle, from Eureka's rebels to the 2008 apology, Australia's shown it can adapt, learn, and grow. Picture a future festival at Uluru, where Indigenous, Anglo, and migrant Aussies celebrate together, their stories intertwined. This land, with its ancient roots and modern dreams, has always been a place of reinvention. Its identity, forged in contrast, united by resilience, is a beacon for what's possible when a nation dares to evolve. So, as we leave this campfire, the stars above whispering tales of dreamtime and discovery, let's carry Australia's story forward. It's a tale of a land that survived, thrived, and dared to dream, ready for whatever the next chapter brings.